good to be with you guys this morning as we're worshiping God together. Hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be looking at the character of Moses as we continue to look at the series Strength of Heart. We'll have two more lessons after this one, and then we'll go to something else. But we're going to look at Moses specifically about how God gave him the courage to handle criticism. How many of you like to be criticized in a mean way? There's good positive criticism, but mostly we get to endure negative criticism. And in the world we live in today, it seems like toxic criticism is everywhere. I don't know if you've noticed that, but it's there. And the hard thing about criticism is that it can strangle our heart until we just want to quit and stop trying anything because we're just tired of the negative things people say. But for you and I, if we're going to be followers of Jesus, to move forward on God's path, not the world's path, but to follow on God's path, we must find the strength of heart to face destructive lies and negative criticism. And we need to be able to face those things with God's grace and God's mercy. It's hard, isn't it? To be gracious and merciful to those who are viciously attacking us. But that's what he's called us to. And that's the exact example that Jesus showed us. Is when criticism comes, we don't let our fangs come out and our fingernails jump out and claw people's faces off. Maybe what's in our mind to do, but that's not what we should be doing. It's unusual, and I don't know that I don't normally do this, but Teddy Roosevelt, he didn't have the exact context in mind, but he, I believe, described this type of courage that we need in his speech, Citizenship in a Republic. And this is what he said: "It is not the critic who counts. It's not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. But the credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place should never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." The political season that we are entering is already filled with extremely negative criticism and a lot of mudslinging. And unfortunately, it's coming out of the mouths of people who claim to believe and follow Jesus. That should not be. See, people attack those who do not share their views. They cannot accept the fact that someone might think differently. And if you're ever on social media, you see that it is filled with harsh and mean-spirited opinions. You and I, again, should not share in that type of ungodliness. It's beneath Jesus. Therefore, it should be beneath us. But what we need to understand that is harsh criticism is nothing unique with us. Harsh criticism has been here for a long, long, long time. It's extremely well documented that God's servant Moses was harshly criticized many times as he tried to serve God's people and lead these people on behalf of God. Moses was criticized by his own people. He was criticized by his own family. The harsh criticism that he received repeatedly could have destroyed the confidence, the heart of Moses. In fact, as God called him at the burning bush, he said, "I am not the man to lead you. I can't speak well." He was a timid man. If you're at all timid, and even if you're not timid, harsh criticism hurts. But that criticism could have destroyed Moses if he did not have the strength of heart that God gives him to overcome it. As you and I look at the life of Moses, we can learn the key, and there's a key to overcoming the criticism that enters into our lives. The first criticism that Moses faced came, this is amazing to me, it came immediately after he led the people out of Egypt and God rescued them at the Red Sea. We're not going to read it now, but you can note this is in Exodus chapter 15, verses 22 to 27. I'm just shocked that only 3 days after the Hebrews saw God miraculously part the Red Sea, that those people could not see God's power and God's willingness to provide for them. 3 days after that amazing sight. And so what did they do? They criticized Moses for not giving them water. They complained all the way through 40 years of wandering. And they wondered why they wandered for 40 years. It was because of their grumbling and complaining and criticizing. But they were constantly complaining that they didn't have enough water, that the food supply was short. So their attacks against Moses, they were very personal. Notice in Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16, verses 2 and 3. The entire Israelite community, no, it's not just a few, but the entire Israelite community, possibly 1.5 million people. Can you imagine being in the middle of 1.5 million people and they're all criticizing you? It'd be a little difficult, wouldn't it? The entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the Israelites said to them, to Moses and Aaron, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt." You know, they cried out to God to free them. Now that they're freed, they're telling the ones who God used to pull them out, "If we'd only died there." It's ridiculous. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt. And then it's amazing how when we're complaining, it's very easy for us to revise history. Oh, it's so much better. The very thing you're screaming to get out of. So now they revise it and say, when we sat by pots of meat, remember these were slaves working 16-hour days and more, beat, whipped. But all they can remember is the lies, the deceptions that we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Instead, you brought us into this wilderness to make this whole assembly die of hunger. So they're laying the whole blame on Moses' shoulder, forgetting that God is the one guiding them. But perhaps they're not forgetting that God is guiding them. But they just can complain and criticize a human because they don't know how to have a good attitude. An attitude of gratefulness and trust and patience. It's just amazing that after everything God had led Moses to do to free these enslaved Hebrews, they had the audacity to tell him they would have been better off if they had stayed in Egypt. Stayed in prison, stayed in a place where the Pharaoh was killing their children, getting rid of the population. It was a life for Moses full of hurtful words and hurtful attitudes directed at him. If you've never had that, you're blessed. If you have, you know how deeply it hurts. And it can hurt for years later. And it can hurt that someone innocuously says something, that they're trying to push a positive scene on something or someone that has totally viciously and deceptively lied about you. It's hard to get past it. See, every single time something went wrong, or something that they wanted they didn't get, their immediate response, criticize Moses. I've got a hangnail. Moses, it's your fault. My kid has a cold. Moses, it's your fault. It's just ridiculous. Everything that came up that bothered them, they had to have someone to blame. That should never be us. That should never be us. In Exodus chapter 17, they needed water again. You can imagine, they're in the wilderness. It's 1.5 million or 2 million people. They're going to need a lot of water. So every time they need something, rather than talking to God about it, they gripe at Moses. So they grumbled and they criticized Moses. And when Moses went and met with God on Mount Sinai, he's meeting on their behalf with the creator and the sustainer of the world. And in the distance, they're able to see a physical manifestation of the incredible power of God. So Moses goes to the top of Mount Sinai, and the people criticized him because he spent too much time talking to God. So while he's at the top of Mount Sinai, the people convinced Aaron that since Moses has been gone so long, we need a different leader. And we need something else to worship. Because they're just taking too much time up there. When we're not patient, and patience isn't something that's just given to you. Patience is a skill that you need to see the need for and the discipline to gain it. It doesn't just happen. It requires discipline. And to have patience requires a change of different attitudes, a change of mindset, taking on personal responsibility, that there are things I can do about it. So Aaron and the people made a golden calf idol to worship because Moses took too long talking to God, and God wasn't down there among them. So the Hebrews also criticized Moses after God led them to the southern part of the promised land. And he sent 12 spies into the land to let them know how vast and beautiful and full of life it was. And then after the spies returned from a promised land, they criticized Moses again for trying to kill them. The spies said the land was filled with fortified cities and strong armies. Well, did you think they wouldn't? And do you not think God can handle it? And do you think Moses didn't know this? See, since they did not trust God, that's the source of our impatience. We don't trust God. Since they did not trust God to help them defeat their enemy, then who do you criticize? Moses. Again, they criticized him for bringing them out of Egypt, leaving them in the wilderness, and telling them they should go into a land that had fortified cities. Numbers 14, 1 through 4. The bottom line for all of this complaining is they didn't trust God. The reason for their grumbling, they didn't trust God. The reason for their impatience, they didn't trust God. See, the criticism that Moses faced didn't just happen one time. It's one thing to periodically, once or twice a year, to be criticized. But if it's an ongoing part of your life, daily, weekly, Moses was constantly criticized for what he did and for how he did whatever it was he was doing. That's kind of hard, isn't it? For what you're doing and how you're doing it, no one is ever satisfied. Well, the wilderness conditions were harsh, no doubt about it. I wouldn't want to be in the wilderness a year, depending on God for food and water. And as a result of their harsh conditions, their criticism became just as harsh. Their criticism was harsh, very pointed, and extremely personal against Moses. And what would have been even more disheartening, because at times when the world is criticizing you, you can kind of pull into your family, but then what happens when you pull into the family and their barbs are just as sharp or more sharp than the people around you? That's what happened to Moses. His family joined the crowds. His family joined the people in their criticism of Moses. It says in Numbers chapter 12. Numbers chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Miriam and Aaron, brother and sister, criticized Moses because of the Cushite woman he married. For he married a Cushite woman. They said, "Does the Lord speak only through Moses?" See, bias caused them to criticize, and bias caused them to look down on their brother, and bias caused them to think they were better than anyone else. Usually biased people are extremely critical of someone who doesn't think like they do, or out of jealousy, they try to knock them down. They said, "Does the Lord speak only through Moses? Does he not also speak through us?" And this is the key point here. These 4 words, "And the Lord heard it." 5 words. The Lord heard it. We need to understand that. When we're criticizing, it's not just the person that's in front of you or the Facebook or whatever platform you're using that the people hear you. God is hearing you. God is seeing your detestable heart condition. God is seeing something coming out of you that shouldn't be coming out of you. And God heard it. So Moses' brother Aaron and his sister Miriam, they were just jealous. Moses didn't want to do this. Aaron was the spokesman because Moses told God, "I can't speak," so God said, "Well, take your brother Aaron." So Aaron is out in front of the people all the time, but people see who the real leader is. Like, do you really want the criticism Moses is getting, Aaron? So they're jealous. Jealous people do that. We need to understand sometimes the criticism that people throw at us, it's very belittling. And the reason they try to belittle us is because they feel insecure in themselves. If they can tear you down, then they feel better because they see that you have worse problems than they do. That's what critics do. Critics aren't there to help you. Critics don't love you. Critics actually hate you and want to tear you down. If you're a critic, you're not following the path of God. You're not following the life of Jesus. Because everything he did, even to his enemies, he tried to build them up to have a walk with God. We need to realize that God absolutely notices when we criticize or belittle other people. And the problem with that is, when someone calls us on it, you've heard it, maybe the words have come out of your mouth, and I'm sorry, but they say, "Well, I was just joking." That's the worst cover-up you'll ever see. God knows the thoughts in our minds before they ever come out of our mouths. God hears, God does. We may kind of want the people who are criticizing to hear or not hear, but as you walk away, and you're, well, God understood the mumbling. God understood the intent. And God understands and sees the evil in the heart that mutters about someone they've just walked away from because you're trying to tear them down and make them feel intimidated. God knows our thoughts, and God will hold us. We need to understand this. When we face him, and we will all face him, face to face after our death or after Jesus returns, God will hold every single human accountable for our critical words towards other people and our critical attitudes towards other people. God takes this very seriously. We don't. We blow it off. God doesn't blow it off. See, not one thing that we post, text, tweet, or share in a conversation, we need to understand this. Not one thing that we share is ever really private. It's not. We see this reality every day as all sorts of people get into trouble for comments that they made in what they thought was a private situation. So what do? Well, we need to guard our hearts. That's the first thing. We need to guard our hearts against having a harsh spirit. We need to guard our hearts against having a critical attitude towards anyone. There are two keys that we'll notice here together this morning. Two keys I see in Moses' life for him to have had the strength of heart to handle the bombardment of criticism that he received. I don't know anyone who would have received as much criticism as Moses did for 40 years. Imagine your job for 40 years, and every day you're criticized. You think you'd have lasted 40 years? If you lasted 40 years, don't you think you might become bitter, mean, arrogant? Not with this man. Because the first key is, whenever he was criticized, Moses turned to God in order to have the strength of heart to overcome criticism. It's key. If your heart is not strong with God, criticism will destroy you. Because the strength of heart comes because we know who God is, we know how God feels about us, we know the character of God, and we know He's got our back. And if I have God with me, then say anything you want because I know the truth is from Him and you're not the truth. We need to hold to that. But if God to you is weak and you don't have a strong relationship with Him, then criticism is going to annihilate you. It's going to cause you to want to stay under the covers and to not speak to people and bow your head down and not make eye contact. We have to know how much God loves us and God provides for us. Moses was attacked from every direction you could imagine. And from every direction came destructive criticism, time after time after time after time, often by hundreds or thousands at a time, all murmuring and complaining and griping. But each time, Moses found strength of heart to handle criticism by first turning to God. That's what we need to do. Notice in Exodus chapter 15, verse 24 through the first part of verse 25. Exodus chapter 15, 24 through the first part of 25. And this is a constant refrain through Numbers and Exodus. The people complained. The people grumbled to Moses. What are we going to drink? So here's his response. Notice he didn't respond to them. You just had water. What are you, camels that need water all the time? He didn't do that. They grumbled to him. What did he do? Verse 25. So he, Moses, cried out to the Lord. And so then God is the one who provides the answers. And the Lord showed him a tree. And when he threw the tree into the water became drinkable. This was the first time as we look at this that the people attacked Moses. But this is key. Moses did not allow the criticism of the people to remove his focus from God. That often happens, right? They harp, and you look at them and you're lost. You lose the battle immediately. Even if you come back with greater criticism, you've become like them. The very thing that bothered you, you've become. We need to focus on God. When people are attacking, just keep constantly focusing on God. Because what does God want to do? God wants to build you up. God is patient with you. God bears with you. God loves you. God shows grace to you. God shows mercy to you. This person is showing none of that. So why do we always tend to lower ourselves to listen to that rather than listen to this? We need to remember that. He never turned away from God. He did not spend a lot of time, if any time at all, thinking about what the people said. But sometimes people, so we go away and then all we do is remember. It goes over and over in our minds and we get madder and we just want to get revenge and we start feeling terrible about ourselves. That's a terrible road to go down. Don't sit around and think about what people said. Think about God. That's a choice. We can make the choice. So Moses kept his focus on God and he asked God for help. He asked God for strength. He asked God for patience to continue to go into the fire and lead these critical people to a promise that God had given to Abraham. He didn't quit the job. What enabled him to keep going in the midst of it? God. His understanding of God. God was so much more real to him than the words of these people. So to overcome criticism, our first response needs to be turn to God and pray. That's stupid. God help me. What a moron you are. God help me. That needs to be our first response, not formulating a reply. There was a period of time in my life when I was jealous of people I would see who had these quick retorts to some criticism. And as time went by, I thought, that's nothing to be proud of. That's nothing to want to aspire to. That doesn't help the situation. That's not a peacemaker. My first reflex needs to be talk to God about it. God, that hurt. God, help me, comfort me, console me. Help me know that I'm not what they said I am. So before we make a response, before we get angry and start defending ourselves by throwing darts back, before we hit back harder than they hit us, before we start throwing sharp, barbed words, we need to turn and ask God for the strength to hear the truth, for the patience to deal with others, and the wisdom to know how and if we should even respond. If we're willing to keep our focus on God, and that takes great discipline and great resolve. But if we're willing to keep our focus on God and not obsess over the words and attitudes of other people, then we will enjoy a great measure of peace and contentment in our lives, even if people are chunking criticism at us constantly. There are two things that we need to do instead of defending ourselves. First, stop and remind yourself who God has called you to be as Jesus' disciple. We really do need to remember who we are and who God wants us to be. Because if we remember that, that will shift our focus from the criticism of the people to God's claim on our life. We often allow criticism to claim our life rather than God to claim our life. And God is always going to build you up. Even if He has to discipline you, it's to build you up. See, our eyes and our hearts need to stay focused on God. The second thing we need to do instead of defending ourselves is to look at Jesus. Look at Him. And if you don't have a clear view of Him, then I encourage you to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And read it for nothing else except to read to see the traits, the character, and the nature of Jesus. How did He respond with His enemies? How did He respond with ignorant people? How did He respond in a world of darkness when He was light and they criticized His being light? How did Jesus handle the tons of criticism He got in the 3.5 years of ministry in God's service? Just like Moses, Jesus was harshly criticized by foes, by friends, and by His family. It's interesting, as you read a lot of the times in the Gospels, Jesus often responded to criticism by not responding at all. There's no law anywhere that says I have to say something back because someone has criticized me. Yeah, but I've got to defend myself. At the point that you feel you have to defend yourself, then there's a problem. You've immediately made these scoffers and these mockers sources of truth, which they are not. We don't need to see them as sources of truth. We need to see them as sources of hell. The flames of hell are coming out of their mouths. Jesus simply kept His eyes on His Father in heaven, and He kept moving forward. We often let what people say stop us. Don't do that. At Jesus' trial, the religious leaders and the Roman officials, they criticized Him and they falsely accused Him. But He didn't defend Himself. He didn't need to defend Himself. For you to walk the path God has called you to, you do not have to defend yourself against naysayers. Why do we feel we have to defend ourselves? God will defend us in His time, in His way. We just need, because as long as we stop defending ourselves against naysayers, we've lost the forward momentum. And God isn't getting glory when we engage in arguments about those things. Jesus simply stayed focused on God. We need to move our focus from the problem to the one who is the solution. Turning to God first when we are criticized is a trait that we have to learn if we are willing to discipline ourselves. And yes, it takes great discipline to bite your tongue and not let the barbs come out back. Oh, that's so hard. It requires discipline. You have to trust that God is good, got your back. You have to trust that you're talking to God about it will make it better, but you don't have to. The fact is, when you go back, you're not straightening anything out. In fact, you are fitting into their scheme and plan is to take you down. And the moment they engage you and you're engaged back, you're done. It doesn't do a thing. Secondly, Moses stayed humble by continuing to turn to God. Humility is key. But I don't learn humility from you. I learn humility from my connection to God. As Moses faced criticism from his family, I find it interesting. In the midst of that criticism from his family, we see in Numbers chapter 12, verse 3. Remember, Moses recorded these first 5 documents. He would not have written this about himself, so you know that God had him write this. And this is God putting into print, so thousands of years later, we could read about Moses something he would have never said about himself. God said Moses was a very humble man, more so than anyone on the face of the earth. Oh, wow. Talk about tears coming down as Moses was writing this, realizing what God thought of him. There you go. You can listen to the words of these people who are naysaying you and all these terrible things about you, or you're going to listen to God who says, what a strong servant you are. What amazing humility you're learning. I'm proud of you. Keep going. We're never going to hear that from these people, so why are we less inclined to engage with God and more inclined to engage with the people who are tearing us down? When people grumbled against Moses, he didn't turn towards them. He didn't lash out at them. He didn't defend himself by telling everyone how right he was and how much he had done for them and how grateful they should be for his leadership. He never did that. We tend to do that. It's not godly. That's worldly. See, when the criticism hit Moses, he humbled himself and he spoke to his God about the criticism that hurt, asking God to soothe the heart that the barbs had punctured, knowing that God could heal him, God could make him strong, and God could give him the strength of heart to move forward again. When they grumbled to Moses about their shortage of food and about their shortage of water, the fact is that was true. They didn't have enough water, and they didn't have enough food. But here's the challenge. When truth is wrapped in sarcasm and barbs of hatred, we sometimes totally forget the truth. So in humility, listen to this. In humility, Moses was able to listen beyond the crucial words. And so he took the concerns of the people to God. The people's attitude was wrong, dead wrong. But there was still truth in what they said about their needs. And this is the key. This is how you know if you're truly humble before God. Moses was humble enough to hear the truth without letting the criticism destroy him. It's the discernment to parse the truth with the criticism, take the truth to God, set the criticism aside, and ask God to help these people. That's humility. That's how God gives us the courage to handle criticism. Humility can diffuse any situation. Humility frees us from the hold that anger and hatred try to get a hold of our hearts with, especially when people become mean and destructively critical towards us. Jesus' humility often diffused difficult situations. If you remember, while the 12 were arguing about who was the greatest, and they were asking Jesus, we want this place of honor when your kingdom comes. And so what did he do in the middle of all that? He washed their feet. Humility. See, Jesus' humility enabled him to rise above the criticism of those who hated him. His humility gave him an overwhelming sense of peace, which helped him deal with the harsher treatment that he later received. It takes great strength of heart to be humble. As you hear harsh words, and you just let them lie on the ground in the dirt where they belong. Overcoming criticism takes great humility. And humility is a learned trait. You want to know the quickest way to learn humility? Serve. Serve others. Serve your enemies. That's what God had Moses do. See, the more we serve God through His church, the more we serve our families, the more we serve our friends, and even the more we serve our foes, the more we begin to move self out of the way to make room for God to reign in our lives. And at that point, when we've set self aside and invited God to be the ruler, at that point, you will find peace in the face of persecution. You will find contentment in the face of criticism. Does your heart feel bruised and battered? Like it's been in a fight with a schoolyard bully? You know, he just pummels you and laughs and in classroom and looks at you and just sneers. We have that. It's exhausting, isn't it? Sometimes our hearts feel exhausted like a blown out candle with a faint glow at the tip of the wick and some wispy smoke coming out. We're just about done. This morning, if you need God's strength of heart, please come as we stand together and sing.